comes to reality, none of that is in practice. None of that reflect the actual atmosphere and ambience of the Muslim community at large. Yes, we have just pockets here and there of representation of how the Prophet ﷺ used to be. This is the Prophet that Allah introduced to the whole world as what? وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. O Muhammad, we have not sent you onto this earth or onto these people or into the world except as a mercy to mankind. Mercy. Mercy. Not as a challenge, not as a curse, not as someone that brings discrimination among people, not as someone that lives for 30, 40 years in a particular country and then he dreams of going back to his home. Excuse me? How do you define home? What is home to us? Home, in the terminology of Rasulullah and Ahlul Bayt, is as follows. Imam Ali was asked, which is the best of homelands? Which is the best of countries? Of course, the Afghani will say Afghanistan, the Lebanese will say Lebanon, the Indian will say India, the Iraqi will say Iraq, the Iranian will say Iran, the Australian will say Australia, the American will say America. But in the terminology of Ahlul Bayt and the Prophet, none of this counts. The place where you are born in is not necessarily your place that you call home. Although there is nothing wrong in calling it home. But in the terminology of Ahlul Bayt, they have always a system in place where they try their level best to shift the paradigm of thinking of humanity into the proper perspective of what makes him human. Imam Ali says, خَيْرُ الْأَوْطَانِ مَا حَمَلَكَ. The best of homelands are those that provide a service for you. That's a homeland. A homeland is the one that gives respect to your integrity and humanity. The one that treats you as a human, not as a number. The country that treats you as an entity, as a proper entity, a respectful entity, an entity that has rights, that has obligation, that is ought to be respected, that is ought to be dignified. So much so that the dignity of a believer in the eyes of Allah is worth more than his own house. The dignity of a human being who believes in God is worth more in the eyes of God than his own house. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam goes to the Kaaba. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq salawatullah salam alayhi goes to the Kaaba. Some of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam have learned this from the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam when they went to perform their Hajj and to sight the Kaaba as well. But let us go to the teacher and the master of all creation, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and see what he said when he went into the vicinity of the sacred mosque and he leaned against the holy Kaaba. The Prophet went and leaned against the holy Kaaba and started communicating with it. He said, Wallah inni a'lamu anna laki hurmatan 'inda Allah. By Allah, I know that you are sacred in the eyes of Allah. ألا وإن حرمة المؤمن أعز على الله منك. But surely the sanctity and the sacredness of a believer is much greater in the eyes of Allah than you. Yet we find it so easy to attack the integrity of Allah, to